So if you haven't been here yet, or the first time or whatever, thanks for coming. What we've been doing is we've been going over kind of an overview of the Old Testament. And we basically have been taking a book of the Bible, such as like what y'all have tonight, like Numbers, and we're just giving the information about it. And so last week I got really eager and I actually printed blank copies of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, thinking I was going to make a lot of hay. And today, in reality, I think we'll do Numbers and Deuteronomy tonight with that. But the whole purpose of all this, again, is just to help us be more location conscious of where things are in the Bible. It's not a deep dive. It's not a deep dive on things. And then also what we're going to do is I didn't give you a sheet for this. I know some of you, I'll ask you to raise your hand. Probably I've written all of it down and you're ready to go and all that good stuff. But we like to compare some of the books of the Bible and those things. But here, let me ask you a question to start with. Someone tell me one of their favorite books of the Bible. And by the way, it's okay to have a favorite book of the Bible. It's not like picking a favorite child or anything like that. But you have like a book of the Bible you like what? Philippians, yeah. Good. Abby?
Esther.
Esther? Yep. Psalms? Yep. Psalms are great.
Ecclesiastes.
Ecclesiastes? Hey. Oh man, I like Ecclesiastes. That's right. Romans? Is that who said it? Man over there said Romans? Yeah. That's great. You know what's funny? I have yet to meet a person that says Numbers or Leviticus. You know, bring it on. But what we started seeing last week is when we got to the book of Leviticus and got out of Exodus, is really, there's a lot of great stuff in Leviticus. You just get caught up in the rituals and all the different things that go on in that. And so we're not going to take time to dive all through that. But in between doing these individual sheets like this, it's like last week, I gave you kind of a comparison, if you were here, the differences between the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus, okay? So tonight what I'm going to do to start with is we're just going to go through looking at this as far as the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, okay? So what's it about? What's it mean? Each book's got a theme, right? Does anybody remember Exodus was the book of, theme, upper right hand corner? You can look at your sheet and cheat. Book of Exodus was the book of
Redemption.
right, book of redemption or deliverance, right? And the book of Leviticus is the book of what?
Sacrifices.
Sacrifices, right? So when you compare these two books, and that's what we're starting with tonight, when you compare Exodus and Leviticus, Exodus is known as kind of the book of pardon, where God pardons, He releases Israel out of Egypt, right? Remember, they were slaves for a while, He pardons them, it's the book of pardon. Leviticus is about purity. Leviticus primarily focuses on your purity, your standing with God, and standing before Him. Exodus being the book of redemption, we are redeemed. It means we've been bought back. So it's kind of like the book of salvation about how God saves us. Leviticus is basically a good example of our sanctification. It's how God sets us apart. The entire theme really of the book of Leviticus is this. God wants to set Him a people apart for Him. He wants to set them apart, sanctify them in that. Exodus is where God's approach to man. Remember, God comes down, burning bush. Go tell the people, let my people go. Tell Pharaoh that. And Leviticus is how man's supposed to approach God. How do we come to God? We got to come to God sanctified, come to God in a pure way. Exodus is like salvation. They came out of Egypt one time, right? So they came physically out of their one-time salvation, the one-time act. But what is sanctification? Leviticus is all about a lifelong, continuing process. I have to wake up every day and preach the gospel to myself. I got to wake up every day and say, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." Say the Lord. It's a lifelong process. It's about that. Okay? And I kind of like this one. It's kind of a little bit redneck way of saying it, you know this, but it's kind of like saying Exodus was about getting Israel out of Egypt. Leviticus, let's get Egypt out of Israel. You know what I mean by that? Egypt is always in the Bible. If you like to know their symbols and things, there are two particular groups of people that are always in the Bible pictured as the world. Egypt's one of them, and the Philistines are the other. They're always, by the way, who is almost all the time they have battles with? The Philistines. Who's David's greatest rival? The Philistines, right? So this is the idea of getting Egypt out of Israel, as far as that part, getting them out of that, those things that they still struggle with. And then that's kind of jotted this at the bottom. It's not originally me, but my Bible professor at Crown said this, and that was really good. He said the book of Leviticus is the Exodus, as the epistles of Paul are the four Gospels. The epistles, by the way, are those letters. You got Romans, you got Ephesians, you got Philippians, Colossians. He says that's what it is. What are the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John mainly about? Here's Jesus Christ. I am that I am is here. Salvation has come through me. And what is a lot of Paul's writings about? A lot of Paul's writing, not completely, because in Romans there's a ton about salvation. All of there's a ton about salvation. But the idea, that's the comparison. And I even like it how God inspired the men that put the Bible together. They didn't put Leviticus first. Because what? Salvation has to come before sanctification, right? It's got to come before it. And so there's a lot of those things. I just want to show you that. I just thought it was kind of a neat little comparison. And I'm going to keep going. Anybody got any questions about this? Comments? Anybody want me to leave this up for 3.5 more seconds or anything like that? It's good. Okay, good. Good. Now, let me ask you this. What do you think of tonight? We're going to jump to the book of Numbers and that sheet that you have. And if I misspell stuff, I thank you right now for your grace and mercy and kindness to me. In that. All right. So, if I pronounce the words incorrectly, Maggie, I appreciate your patience with all that. Rachel being here, I'll be mailing. Robustly talking to her. I've been talking about that today. But you got that sheet in front of you. And remember, this is just kind of an overview. I will go ahead and tell you, I have never heard anybody in life tell me, you know, one of my favorite books of the Bible, Numbers. Numbers, the book, man. I mean, I love Numbers. But we're going to go through a little bit tonight, and I'm not going to do a deep dive on it. But can I tell you, there's a ton of stories in the Bible that we forget a lot of times that are out of the book of Numbers. They're really out of the book of Numbers. Numbers is, if you've seen, there's 36 chapters in the book of Numbers. Here's why Numbers is a problem. When they start doing the numbering, and all that, you're like, oh, you're killing me. Next, and you go on, and you normally skip books. Like everyone likes the book of Deuteronomy more than Numbers. Deuteronomy is fabulous. We're going to get to that tonight. We're going to do a lot of erasing and putting stuff up here. Deuteronomy, as we'll see in a little bit, is Moses' last sermon. Moses gets up in Deuteronomy and he says, I got one more chance to talk to you before I leave this earth. This is what I'm leaving you. And so it's really neat. I didn't put this up here, but here's something neat about the book of Numbers. When we pick up the writing and the events in the book of Numbers, you remember when they go to Mount Sinai and God gives the 10 Commandments? God kept them there for a year. God kept them at Mount Sinai, around that mountain for 1 year. So when you pick up the book of Numbers, it's when they start to leave Sinai. God says, this is the law. Thou shalt not. All that. So when you pick up Numbers, God is saying, I've given you the law. Now I'm going to guide you as you go towards the promised land. So it kind of gives you a little bit of a time frame, if you like that. The author is Moses. I went to a lot of detail in Genesis about Moses and everything about him. I'm not going to do that again. Soon we'll get to the book of Joshua, and you'll have a different author instead of writing Moses down every time we get the author there. The date of it, they believe, is around 1405 BC. And does anybody remember when do we think it is? I've said it, each week. We believe they did it when they were wandering in the wilderness, right? For the 40 years. While they were wandering in the wilderness is when I believe Moses wrote that. Okay, so that's the date of it. And again, if y'all have any comments or thoughts on this, you always can jump in. As far as the occasion of the book and the purpose of the book, the reason they call it Numbers is because there's two census that goes on. In the very beginning of the book, when they leave Mount Sinai till they get close to actually the River Jordan to cross over, there's two numberings. There's one at the beginning of the book and there's one at the end of the book. And that's my joke, because one of them's at the very beginning of the book, everybody's like, really? Okay, keep going in this book. That's what it's about. Okay, that's what it's about. Now I gave you a very condensed outline right here, but I am going to throw a few things at you just for you to see some interesting things here in the book of Numbers. It's mainly got three things. It's the book of the journey, as we said. And I'll tell you these three things, and then I'd like to go back and maybe give you a few little added pieces. The first 9 chapters are all preparation. This is where you get tied down that, as Numbers says, to be holy and to live a holy life, all those different things that goes in there, everything about the priest and things about sin. I will tell you one interesting thing that you'll find in the first few chapters of Numbers. I believe it's chapter number 6. You get the Nazarite vow. So does anybody remember who was a Nazarite in the Bible? Samson. Jesus. There's another one in the New Testament. Well, 2 in the New Testament. John the Baptist, but there's another one people don't think of. The Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul was a Nazarite. He had a Nazarite vow. And so I find that very interesting. We don't normally think of it when you study his heritage and people. He was a Nazarene. And so all that, the vows that you couldn't cut your hair, you couldn't touch a dead body, you couldn't drink any wine, you couldn't do those certain things. If you know that and know those rules and read Paul, it makes sense. The way he makes some stances on some things in that. That's in chapter 6 of the book there. And so a lot of different offerings and things. The second main section are the problems on the journey. This is where I think this is my favorite part. Is of the book. It's not because other people have problems, but they had problems. They had a lot of them. To give you an idea, I'm going to look at some of these here, just to let you know. Here in the book of Numbers, talking about the problems that they had, and they had, to be flat honest with you, they had a ton of problems. But the whole deal with the problems is this: there was always complaining, criticism, and crisis. That explains pretty much all 11 of those chapters. There was always complaining, criticism, and then they fell into crisis. I mean, that's pretty much total what happened in those chapters. I'll just throw some stuff out at you just so in case you want to know. If you don't want to know, it's okay. To give you an idea, in chapter number 11, children of Israel complained about manna. Moses, we've been out here forever, man. Only thing we got is this manna. By the way, you know where manna was? Angel food, which literally woke up in the morning, think about never having to go to the store again. They got up in the morning, walked out, God literally made it fall from heaven, sit right there for them. They walked out, grabbed their food. They said it was like honey wafers in their mouth. It was just delicious in their mouth. And they gathered up what they needed for the day, and that was it. The day before the Sabbath, they weren't allowed to do any, so they took enough for both days. So God gave them their food the entire time. Wouldn't that be awesome? But then again, wouldn't that get old? So they literally complained to Moses. Moses, in chapter 11, we want meat. The manna's not good enough. When we lived back in Egypt, we had all these things that we enjoyed. Out here, we're just stuck with this old manna. And God sends quail. I mean, they wake up the next day and there's quail just falling out of the sky, and they get it and they start eating it. And the Bible even says in chapter number 11, verse 31, is that when the food was yet in their mouth, that the wrath of God went against them, and many thousands of them died for questioning God with that. So God gave them what they wanted, which Bible is a wonderful picture of. It is great when God doesn't always give us what we want, because when we do get what we want, sometimes it's the death of us. And for them, it literally was the death of them. They actually have, you have to write this down, it's a very hard word to say. It says he called the name Kibroth Hattaavah because they buried many people there because of their lust for brothers. So that's because they wanted that. So that's there. And again, I knew I would take some time tonight with this. Chapter 12 is the famous chapter where when Aaron and Miriam are Moses' brother and sister, they complain about Moses being in charge. But they do something extra that a lot of people don't pay attention to. Does anybody know Moses was married? He had a wife by the name of Zipporah. Yeah, Zipporah. And so Zipporah was, while Moses was in the backside of the desert, father-in-law Jethro, we love good old southern Jethro name. So his daughter Zipporah, we believe, was of Ethiopian descent. And so she actually was darker skinned. And it says that actually Miriam and Aaron, and Miriam in particular, his sister, actually mocked her and became very racist against her.
Yes, they did.
To the point where God actually sent her outside of the camp for 7 days, struck her with leprosy for doing that. Like she had to go outside of the camp with leprosy with that for mocking Moses and for mocking basically racism against Miriam. So that was kind of an interesting thing. By the way, I don't know how Moses did get very prideful, but I'll be like, dude, don't talk about me, don't talk about my wife. Okay, but so you get those things. So again, these are just stories. You don't have to write this stuff down if you don't want to. Chapter 13 is where they sent the spies to go out on Canaan. So we're still in Numbers. We're just in the first few chapters of Numbers here. We'll sing it probably in BBS 12 men went to spy on Canaan. 10 were bad, 2 were good. So they send them out. They send one for every tribe. One for every tribe. Send the tribal leaders out. Send them out. And so they send them out and they go. The spies come back. If you remember in chapter 13, it says that they came back and they said, man, the land is exactly as God said. I mean, it's a land truly that flows with milk and honey. So they bring back a cluster of grapes. It takes 2 men to carry. Bring that stuff on. I mean, that stuff sounds great. But if you remember in chapter 14, part of the problem is 10 of the 12 said, but we can't go. Anybody remember why?
The giants in the land.
That's right. The children of Anak were there. The giants in the land. And they said, we are to them as grasshoppers. There's no way we can go in there and defeat these giants. By the way, Goliath, he comes after his ancestors were the children of Anak. So it's kind of neat how all that even lines up with that children of Anak that you see there. That's verse 33 of chapter number 13. So what does the Bible say that these spies did to the people's heart? It melted the people's hearts. Because what God has already parted the Red Sea, He's dropped manna from heaven, He's dropped quail. He's done all these different things. He's got water coming out of a rock. He's got all these different things happening. But when it came to the actual giants in the land, they said, we can't do it. And that's the moment when Joshua and Caleb said, let's go now, let's take these guys out, we can accomplish it right now. But it says they did not believe in God's punishment to Israel, is in chapter 14, and that leaves around verse 26 where God says, every one of these guys that doubt me, anyone over the age of 20, will not step foot in the promised land. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine being a kid with parents and hearing that and knowing that? And that's why God made them in the wilderness for 40 years. He let them out. He basically let them out and live their life out. They were done. During that time, everyone under the age of 20, the new generation, which you'll see is really what all of Deuteronomy is for. It's not for the ones that came out of Egypt. Deuteronomy is for the ones that were born during the wilderness travelings and really the children that were brought out. It's really for them how they should live there, because all the rest of them turned against God in that. So you see that, and so a lot of those kind of interesting things there that you see in the book. And again, thanks for letting me take a second here. I like seeing this. I'll explain it more in just a little bit. But chapter 16 is these guys, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. These are guys, these are leaders. They basically come up to Moses and they try to overthrow Moses. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. There's a lot of times you don't hear people named Korah or Dathan and Abiram now. You know why? Because they turned the hearts of the people against Moses and against God. God actually, and I'm paraphrasing, got so angry because they tried to split or make a mutiny against Moses that God looks at Moses and says this, hey, I'm going to put you aside. I'm going to strike down all these people, and out of you and Zipporah, I will raise a mighty nation out of you. But this is one of the times, and I love this in Scripture, it says, but Moses pleaded to God for the people. That Moses actually got on his knees and said, God, don't destroy me. God, you are a gracious God. God, you are a loving God. He pleads everything about God to that. And so what's ended up happening is this in the story. And again, I just like the story. I'm taking some time. But so Moses stands up and says with Aaron, he said, everyone that wants to follow under my leadership and wants to follow and trust the Lord, come on this side. Everyone wants to be Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, go on that side. And there's thousands of people that stay with Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. But after everyone makes their claim who they're with, the Bible actually says the earth opens, God opens the earth and swallows all of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, their families, never alive, and it closes back up. Talk about wish you had a phone at that time to get to see that. So anyway, so again, people that say the Old Testament is boring, they are not reading the same thing I'm reading with that. So, but what's the whole problem with that? God is faithful, and when we question the faithfulness of God, when we disobey God, and what we're doing really calling his character into question there. So there's a lot of that stuff through there, a lot of different things. Man, I can talk for a long time. In the book of Numbers is where you get Moses' rod that he had, or the big rod. That's when it starts to bud. It doesn't bud because it's in the ground and planted. It buds because God blesses it and it buds and does those things. So anyways, and then the last 14 chapters are preparation for new leadership. These last 14 chapters is Moses preparing the people for Joshua to take over. And it's also preparing Joshua for stepping into his shoes. And so it's really, really what a lot of that is about. There's a lot of great things in that. I was going to tell you that I promise I won't put that in detail. I'm not supposed to do it anyway. Chapter 20 to me is really one of those, if you highlight things in your Bible, chapter 20 is, that's the chapter where God tells Moses, don't hit the rock. And Moses hits it twice, and that's where God says, greatly disobeyed me. Moses, you will not enter the promised land. But if you got your Bible, look into the very first verse of Numbers chapter 20. And here's why I say that. When we read about all this, we're like, Moses, you're the man. Moses, you did all this. God told you not to hit the rock, and yet you hit the rock and you lost going to the promised land. I mean, how stupid you got to be. Well, let me tell you just in reading the first verse what's happening in Moses' life. Okay? Numbers chapter 20. Does somebody mind reading just the very first verse?
I will.
Thanks, Andrew.
It says, then came the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, into the desert of Zin in the first month. And the people abode in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. Was that right?
Yep. Okay. So, the very next verse, do you mind reading 2 and 3? I'm sorry.
Yeah. And there was no water for the congregation, and they gathered themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people chode with Moses and spake, saying, would God that we had died when our brethren died before the Lord.
Thank you. So, we always talk about, man, Moses, why did you hit the rock? God told you to speak to it. I would have water come out. Man, Moses, why did you do that? Well, because the people were angry at Moses, but you know what Moses had just done moments earlier? Buried his sister. He had just buried his sister, whom he loved, whom he brought out of Egypt. I mean, yeah, you said, well, Miriam made fun of Zipporah. Well, I feel like Moses probably forgave that and got over that. Moses had no sooner put Miriam in the ground than they take the next step to go away, and they're like, you leave us out here to die, man. And it says Moses gets angry. And they're not just mumbling. They're not just a complaint box. They're really going off on him. So I'm not trying to give Moses a pass here, but I'm just trying to get you to understanding. I love Moses. Moses is one of my favorite characters in the Bible. I mean, Moses endures with his limitations, a lot of things. But Moses, I mean, you know how it is in life when people just chide you and just are on you and on you. I mean, he just walked away from the funeral. I mean, he just walked away. And so that's when you get Moses, he's angry and all those things. And I even see the grace of God. Remember, he goes up and he hits the rock after God says, hey, don't hit the rock, man. Just talk to the rock. And Moses is angry. He's not really angry at God. He's angry at the people. He hits the rock again. And what does God do? He brings water out, right? Water comes out. But that's where you get one of the verses that we'll see here in just a minute with that. And give you an idea. In fact, we'll go ahead and do that. We'll jump from there to our key verses. So if you're there in Numbers 20, look at verse number 12. Somebody mind reading verse 12? Numbers 20?
And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, because he believed ye not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them.
Thank you. To me, that's one of the saddest verses I think there is in the Bible in all of Moses' life. Is that Moses has buried his sister. All this is happening. And God says, because you what? You didn't believe me. You didn't trust me. I'm not going to let you take these people in. They have to have somebody that's going to believe me and trust me. And if you're me, I'm sitting there going, but I mean, can we get to do the pass a little bit here? Can we go back? But that's just the holiness that God demands in that position that he wants. He's like, you're not one of these people. You're not even one of the tribal leaders. You're my leader. You're the one I've called out. I mean, it's a higher expectation than he really had there for Moses. And so that's the verse where you see where God said, you're not going to get to do it, man. You're not going to get to do it. You're not going to take them out. And if we want to, we'll back up just a little bit. But another key verse, and some of this is opinion. You say, well, I like this verse. That's great. You like the verse right now? What are we doing here? Is Numbers chapter 14. Numbers 14, verse 22 through 23. Somebody mind reading Numbers 14, verse 22 through 23?
I got it.
Thank you.
Because all those men which have seen my glory and my miracles, which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have tempted me now these 10 times, and have now not hearkened to my voice, surely they shall not see the land which I swear unto their fathers, neither shall any of them that provoke me see it.
Thank you. Wow. You're kind of noticing that in Numbers there's a little bit of judgment. It's kind of like I've given you the opportunity in Leviticus. This is how you approach it. This is how you live a pure, holy life. and you didn't do it, this is it. I have this as kind of in my notes. In chapter 20, verse 12, and I didn't have enough for me to write, I wrote this down. I write, if you disobey God, your life will always be a wilderness experience. That if you disobey God, your life will always be a wilderness experience. You're just going to wonder. If you disobey God, your life will always be a wilderness experience. And then in the verses that Justin just read in chapter 14, verse 22 and 23, I wrote this down. You see judgment for disobedience, but blessing for obedience. You see judgment for disobedience and blessing for obedience. It's kind of like we just read there. He said, because why? You're not going to see it because you promote me, which is what's the flip of that? You're going to see it because you honor me. It's the opposite of that, right? That you see it in that. And then this is one that I wrote down, and this is probably my personal favorite, is in Numbers for verses. It's Numbers chapter 6, verse 24 through 26. Numbers chapter 6, verse 24, verses 24 through 26. Lord, bless thee and keep thee. Lord, make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. Lord, lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. What wonderful words there that God gave Moses to say to them. I tell you, those words mean a lot to me. I share them a lot of times if I'm doing a funeral or something, because it's just a lot there that's being said. But anyhow, those are some verses there for you. Main characters in the book, if you want to look here, is, of course, we're always going to throw Moses until there's no more Moses. We're going to put him there. Of course, the tribal leaders, and what I mean by tribal leaders is really the 10 spies are like, oh, we don't want to go, right? You know, we don't want to go. But then Joshua and Caleb are the only ones, by the way, only ones over 20. They got to go into the promised land. We'll talk more about Caleb when we get into the book of Joshua. So Caleb's like 85, 90 years old when God gives him, they start divvying up the land. This is a side note, it's just a teaser a little bit for next week. So Caleb's older, and guess where he chooses what part of the land he wants. Give me the land where the giants are, I'll go kill them all. And it says that he went, he's like, I'll bring it, I'll go, that's the land I want. And God gives Caleb that land and gives him victory in it. So you get Caleb, and then you get Joshua. And then I wrote down the negative generation. And I broke that down as in those two things I told you about. Being negative, we see Miriam and Aaron, how they question Moses, and then Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. If you want to tell your kids a good Bible story to go to sleep at night, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram was not in it. Okay? But if you want to tell them the earth opened up, swallowed them up, went back. I mean, swallowed up tents, everything. It was, we cannot imagine again. I would, HDTV, I would be really intrigued about what all that looked like. All right, for special features, and what I mean by special features, there's certain things about the books that are just kind of special, and then a little bit later we'll talk about how there's pictures of Christ in it. When you read this and kind of how they go together, the book of Genesis is really about this, how God called his people. Remember, he called his people. The book of Exodus is how God redeemed his people, right? The book of Leviticus, all the rules, all the things you got to do, is where God sanctified his people. And Numbers is where God judges his people. By the way, even in this, you see the grace of God blind. Because where do you see judgment? After being called, redeemed, sanctified. They had everything they needed to do that. And some good references that go along through that. We're not going to read them tonight. 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through, I'm going to say 1 through 12. Forgive me for that. Some of y'all know I just make it bad. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay, but 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 12, and then Hebrews chapters 3 and 4 are about that. Hebrews chapters 3 and 4 are about that. And then for pictures and prophecies of Christ, and again, I think this is just really, really awesome when you read the story of this. Do you remember the story, or do you know what I'm talking about when I say the bronze serpent? The brazen serpent, whatever. So to give you an idea, in chapter number 21, the people complained against, like they didn't learn. It's like you just didn't see 1,000 people swallowed in a hole. Okay, you didn't learn, you didn't get that. So the people mumbled and they complained, or murmured and complained, they probably mumbled too, murmured and complained and did all that. And so God actually sends out fiery serpents. And they start getting bit and they start dying. And they're dying and they cry out to Moses, cry out to God for us that we may not all perish and die. So in Numbers 21, what happens is this, is that they cry out to Moses. Moses, again, on behalf of the people, cries out to God, hey, please, God, spare us. And we know what God tells him to do? He says, take a pole, take a bronze serpent, and strap it to the top of the pole, raise it up, and tell everyone, if you'll look, you'll live. I love the old hymn, and I don't know if you ever look and live, my brother lived. Anybody ever heard that hymn before? It's in our book. We don't sing it because, like, I know it. That's about it. With that, the song is, it's recording God's word, hallelujah. It's only that you look and live. But it says you take that snake, put it up on the pole, and do that. Which, by the way, you that are in the medical field, nursing and stuff, that's where they get the symbol from. The pole and the snake, they get it from Numbers 21. That's where it's taken from. Because if you'll just come to that, look and live. That's where it is. Come to us, we will help you. So I always find that interesting in that. So that's what that part's about in Numbers when it talks about telling us look and live. Now, there is something very cool over in the book of John, chapter number 3. Because what God tells Moses is, if you'll take it and lift it up, then I will save the people. Remember what the book of John says? John chapter 3. Jesus says, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto myself. It's a quoting Numbers there, the serpent. Jesus saying, I'm going to be the thing that's sacrificed. I'm going to be the thing lifted up. And how does Jesus die? He dies on the cross, what? Lifted up above man. So it's even, to me, it gives me chills to even think about all the way back in Numbers. Amen. There's a prophecy of Christ. This is how Christ will come. As the serpent was raised up in the wilderness, Jesus says, so shall the Son of Man be lifted up. He shall be lifted up. So anyway, I found that cool. So Balaam's prophecy, so it's kind of funny that you have this, but in chapter 24, you get the story about Balaam and the donkey. You remember that? The donkey talks and all that stuff. Do you remember? So what basically happens is children of Israel getting close to the promised land. One of the foreign kings sees them and says, oh man, I need somebody that will come. I need some kind of witch doctor. I need some kind of prophet. I need something to come put a curse on them. So he goes and finds Balaam. And Balaam won't do the curse. And he said, I'll go with you, but I won't do the curse. And as they're going, basically it says an angel with a flaming sword stood before the donkey, and the donkey bashed. Balaam hurts his ankle, does all that, and Balaam gets really angry at the donkey. They go a little bit further. He sees the angel again, and the donkey ain't having it. I'm not going up there and get killed by an angel with a sword. He doesn't actually say that, but that's probably what the donkey's thinking. And so he bashes his legs again, and his legs get all messed up, mangled up. And it's funny as this, is Balaam talks to the donkey talks back to Balaam, and Balaam keeps having a conversation with the donkey. So you think you're having a bad day, you ain't talking to animals, and animals are talking back. But I always find that funny, that Balaam's thing there in that part of it, and plus you see the angel there. And then when I wrote down the blessing of guidance, and there's so much I want to tell you about the blessing of guidance, but this is the book where God says, during the day, I'll have a cloud. When the cloud stops, you stop. When the cloud moves during the day, backing stuff up and go with the cloud. Do you remember what he did at night? Pillar of fire. Pillar's there. That's always a symbol of God's presence and guidance in your life. God is with you, and God will go with you, and God will lead you. And so I always find that very interesting. I don't know, anybody else ever sometimes hear this stuff and you're like, man, these children of Israel messed up, man. I don't know how you get all this stuff. I mean, God is fire in the sky, you see it, but we're the same way in that. And then the last part here is where God gives them in chapter number 35, they talk about the cities of refuge. That when they get into the promised land, there's going to be what they're calling cities of refuge. Anybody ever heard that before, the cities of refuge? What the cities of refuge was, and God was having Moses tell them, is this. There were going to be these cities built. And in these cities were going to be the priests. And what it would be is this. So let's say Justin's working. He's working with another person. Let's just say he's got a coworker. And as Justin's working, he's doing something, and he's chopping wood or something, the axe falls, hits the guy he's working with, and it kills the guy, right? It's manslaughter. It's an accident. It's not murder. right? So the guy's family, the victim's family, gets angry, and they're like, hey, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, or blood for blood. That's what the Bible says, man. That's what it says. But since it was an accident, it was not intentional. Justin had the ability then to go to the city of refuge. And if he can make it in the city of refuge, it was basically asylum. He was free. And while he was there, whoever was the high priest would hear the case for both and would judge. And if he was guilty of actually murder, he would send him out to be killed. But if he wasn't, and this is the part that's a beautiful picture of Christ, if he was looked at as he was not guilty, it was an accident, as long as that high priest had breath in him and lived, that guy had protection. He had protection. So until that guy died, which you probably didn't want a 90-year-old guy, got it. But I mean, as long as you had that guy died. But here's the great, who's our high priest? Christ. What does Satan constantly do to us? The Father accuse us. So as long as we have our great high priest and he's alive in heaven, we are constantly have asylum. We have freedom. It wasn't an accident. We're guilty in that. So that's again another beautiful picture of the sinner's refuge there for that. But I want to show that. So as I said, there's a ton of really, really great stuff that I think you see in the book of Numbers. Does anybody got any questions, comments, smart remarks, anything like that? Something you like about it, or anything at all?
Can you tell me the chapter in John again, certain?
John 3. And I can do that real quick, just to give you the verse, unless somebody else has got it already. Yeah, verse 14. John 3:14 says, and as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God so loved the world. That's right there in that verse. You know what's crazy is if you I'm just throwing it out there, if you ask people John 3, we pretty much know John 3:16. Yep. That's what we know. But that all leads up. And you know who Jesus is talking to when he tells them that? Pharisees. Nicodemus. That's the ninth time with the big Pharisee Nicodemus. And Jesus is like, you know the law. You know what Moses said. And that's who I am. I've come to fulfill the law. Isn't it? So a lot of really, really neat things there. And if you don't mind, I know we're going to jump to Deuteronomy in a second. There was one thing that I wanted to give you, and it's going to require me to do a little bit of erasing here just for a second. And I'll try to go through this really, really fast. But I want to give you just a comparison. And I know I told this the other day, I joked I need to buy like 7 of these boards so I can have enough. But I want to give you just real quick. You know, Aaron was the first what? Priest, right? So the priesthood of Aaron, there is a comparison that I just want to give you real quick to the priesthood of Jesus Christ. And I'll be very, very, very fast with this because I do want to get to Deuteronomy with you for this. Okay? So for Aaron, he was Israel's first high priest. First high priest of Israel, first one. You see that in Leviticus 16 with that. And you see with Christ, he is our high priest. That's going to be HP if you don't mind. And by the way, if you like the book of the book of Hebrews, there's a lot of fulfillment in Hebrews. Christ is our high priest there. And that's what you see there. Aaron was called of God from among the people. I'll abbreviate people there if you don't mind. He was called of God from among people. And I'm going to write this, and you may not get it to begin with, but if you look up Hebrews 5:4, this is the wording of it. Christ was called of God. He is God. I'm not knocking the deity of Christ here. Called of God from among people or among men. You will see that if you look in Hebrews chapter number 5. verse number 4. Somebody mind reading that?
And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was.
Just as Aaron was called of God. Was called of God. Christ was called of God. And that whole chapter 5 is speaking of Christ is our great high priest. Whole book of Hebrews, if I could sum it up as this: a greater than Moses is here. That's what Hebrews is. Because they are stuck on Moses, right? A little bit, well, I think it hit myself. Anyway. Aaron had compassion on the wayward. Sometimes he had a little too much compassion. Started building calves and stuff like that. Okay, he had compassion on the wayward. You even see that again in Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. And then Jesus, how did Jesus pray? Jesus prayed with tears. Isaac, you still there in Hebrews 5?
Yeah.
Will you read verse 7?
In the days of the flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence.
So the priesthood of that is that when Christ prayed, he prayed with tears. A lot of people think Christ prayed in the garden because what he's about to go through. Now, he prayed with tears for us. Those were tears for us in that. And that's what it's talking about. Aaron had compassion for the wayward. He had that there. Aaron had to be spotless. He had to be spotless in his dress and what he wore, because it was a symbol of purity. He had a special outfit that he had to wear that had to be spotless when he went into the Holy of Holies. And of course, Jesus was spotless in character. Jesus was spotless in character. When Aaron went in, he went in to, he had to go in wearing a certain outfit. A certain outfit had to be clean. Like he couldn't have any spot, any blemish, anything on it. The next thing is this, is Aaron entered the Holy of Holies. Aaron entered the Holy of Holies, and then Jesus, after the sacrifice, where he entered heaven. And you see that in chapter number 9, verse 24 of Hebrews. Everybody good? Make anybody mad? Okay. I just got a couple more. Okay. All right. So Aaron would make atonement with the blood of a goat. And of course, Jesus made atonement with his blood. With his own blood. He was the sacrifice. And I'm just jotting these down. Aaron offered sacrifices. The sacrifice was for himself and the nation. When Aaron had to do a sacrifice, he couldn't just do a sacrifice for the people. It had to be a sacrifice for himself too. He had to enter into it that way. In fact, the law was, after Aaron, if a high priest, who's the only one allowed to go through that veil into the Holy of Holies, if he went in without offering sacrifices and asking for forgiveness of sin, the Bible says that God would strike him dead. Because when you went into the Holy of Holies, that's where the Ark of the Covenant was, which is a picture of God's presence. I know some of y'all watched the old Indiana Jones movie. Okay, you get it, kind of, with it. There's no Germans there in numbers. But anyhow, so what happens when you go in there, you had to enter into the presence of God, holy spotless. So they actually would do this. I always find this humorous. Some of you may know. Whenever a high priest would go in, they always had a rope tied around his ankle with bells on it. And for some reason, didn't hear any jingling for a while. That was their way. It's kind of funny, but it's the way it was. They would drag him back out that way because they couldn't go in and get him because they would be entering into the Holy of Holies. I mean, that's how serious God did all of that in that part of it. And with Jesus, he offered, his sacrifice was for the world. Sacrifice was for the whole world. I'm just going to write that down. So Aaron had a sacrifice for himself and the nation. Jesus offered sacrifice for the whole world in that. And then the last thing I have on this, which I'm glad I'm not out of order. is Aaron's offering was a continuous thing. It was a continuous thing. He would go in once a year for that. And Jesus' offering was once for all. And we won't read it tonight, but Hebrews chapter 9, verses 25 through 26 are some pretty awesome verses about that. That when Jesus died on the cross, that he was a sacrifice once for all of eternity. Once for all of eternity, Christ was the sacrifice there. With that, I appreciate y'all letting me take that. Because I wanted to get to that. I see that need. Y'all like that? I mean, to me, I see a lot of greatness there when you compare this with that. So, if you need a coffee break, water break, if you need a smoke break, whatever you need to do, like help me out here. But I'm gonna go through some of this real quick with. If you don't care, I just really like to get through Deuteronomy, if that's okay. It's not okay to leave all period to it out. Deuteronomy. I will try to get everything on here for you. I make lots of promises. Deuteronomy is really one of my favorite books of the Bible. Just because I heard a man say this a long time ago and I thought it was really good. I don't remember who it was. I was going to say Spurgeon, but anytime you hear something you don't know, we always blame it on Spurgeon. With that, he said, whenever you get up to preach as if it's the last time you get a chance to talk to those people. Like anytime you get up to preach. And that's why you always hear me joke. I was joking, I think with Justin in April today about what's warm and fuzzy. I'm trying to get that out of my vocabulary, warm and fuzzy, what we talked about today. But he's like, when you always speak to people truth, but speak to them as if it's the last chance you get. That's what Deuteronomy is. Deuteronomy is Moses's, hey, this is it. In fact, the book of Deuteronomy, to be totally honest with you, the book of Deuteronomy is all about this. He's giving heed to a new generation coming. Because if you remember the book of Psalms, it talks about how your fathers provoked me in the wilderness. All the ones that came out of Egypt, you provoked me in the wilderness. You did those things. And he's given it to a new generation of people. So that's what it's about. So obviously, the author, Moses, we talked about again. About the same date here that you're going to have with it. We do believe that Joshua wrote chapter 34. It'd be kind of hard for Moses to write, and I died. Okay? I'm not putting it beyond the extreme of God, and I died. Okay, but that would be it. So we see that, chapter 34, with it. Underneath, and I pretty much have said this, it's pretty much Moses' farewell speech, or farewell sermon. I mean, to a new generation, it's his farewell one. Like, this is what I want you to know. It's kind of like this. If God gave us the ability, when it was our time to go, when we had a sound mind, and if I could impart whatever I got left, important things, God graced Moses with that opportunity to do so. In that, the outline of the book, there's a phrase that you see over and over again, and I just want to write this down. The theme of the book is this little phrase you see over again: take heed lest thou forget. You see that phrase a lot in the book of Deuteronomy. Take heed lest thou forget. That's a little King James right there for you. Some of us in our new language be like, hey, don't be dumb, or something like that, right? So, and there's four main keys, I guess. And I'll write these down for you. Four main parts of the outline. first main thing is remember the past. You see that in chapters 1 through 4. The second one is commands for the present, or how they should live now. And that's a large chunk of the book. That's chapter 5 through chapter 26. Number 3 is what we call options affecting the future. And what I mean by when I say options affecting the future is kind of like if you do this, God says, then I'll do this for you. If you don't do this, this is how it's going to affect your future. And you see that in chapters 27 through 30. And then the parting words of Moses is the fourth thing. Parting words of Moses. And you see that there in chapter 31 through 33. And if you're thinking, Phil, you just said that there's 34 chapters. Remember, you can't say I died with that. So you kind of see the different things he gives. Just to give you an idea, and I'll write these, write some of these down. Some of the key verses, chapter 1, verse 3, is really great. I've got down chapter 6, verses 3 through 7. Those are really, really good. Chapter 6 is a great book on parenting. Is a great chapter on parenting. In fact, if you don't mind, let's read that real quick. Chapter 6. You're like, man, I just wish someone came up with a really cool book about parenting and what we should do. Deuteronomy 6 is pretty key to that. Does somebody mind reading Deuteronomy 6, verses 3 through 7? Thank you.
Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord God of your fathers promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Am I reading right thing? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. These words I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise.
Thank you. So, man, that's some pretty cool stuff right there. Remember, what are the 2 great commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. That's right there. That's what he says. He tells them that you need to observe to do it. I mean, you got to observe. You got to pay attention to do it. And he says, and here's the thing. And this is the part to me that is great when it comes to parenting. The idea is this. So I will impart something to my children. Like, verse 7 says, and thou shalt teach your children. You are going to impart something. So we'll either impart how we love the Lord with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, or we won't. I mean, there is no kind of in between there. I mean, it's really, really just a great passage. I mean, there's a lot, just to be honest there with it. And just to be honest, even in the verses, I wrote this down, and I'm not going to read this to you. But chapter 32 is really, I like to put down as a key verse. This is actually known in history to the Jews as the Song of Moses. This is his song. It's really a beautiful song. And the song basically consists of a few things. It talks about how God is a just God. He's a righteous God. It goes on to talk about how he's a jealous God. He's a jealous God. He is a God that he will conquer all their captives. And also he's a God of vengeance. It talks about he's a God of mercy. And it's really, really beautiful, really, the Song of Moses. It's a kind of a long chapter. It's 52 verses. But it's kind of Moses just telling them, I mean, he's about to take his last breath. He's about to be done. And he's talking about, hey, he's a good God. And he's merciful. He's a just God. He's a jealous God. He's a vengeance. What does the Bible say? Vengeance is mine. I will repay, say the Lord. They get that from Deuteronomy. They get that from Deuteronomy. And if you're there, I wouldn't mind reading this to you. I think it's really neat. There in chapter number 32. And I just want the relationship that Moses and God have. I gotta be honest with you, I'm almost envious of it. You know, I mean, but I want to read this to you in Deuteronomy 32, verse 48. This is the end of the song. It said, "The Lord spake unto Moses that self same day, saying, Get thee up into this mountain, Abarim, unto Mount Nebo, so go up to Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, that is over against Jericho, and behold, and look into the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel for possession." So he's like, isn't that pretty cool? He said, I'm going to take you up to Mount Nebo. I'm going to let you look over. You're not going to get to go in. I'm going to let you see it. I'm going to let you see it. And I want you to go up this mountain. But look what he said in verse 15. And die in the mountain where thou goest up, and be gathered to thy people. As Aaron thy brother died in Mount Hor, and was gathered to his people. Because ye trespassed against me among the children of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, because ye sanctified me not in the midst of the children of Israel. Yet thou shalt see the land before thee. Thou shalt not go in thither into the land which I shall give unto the children of Israel. I mean, those are some pretty interesting verses there. When you see that he said, God was still in grace, saying, I got to stick to my word. I'm not going to let you go in. I'm going to let you see it. I'm going to let you see it. I'm going to let you see it. And when he takes him up there, he says, I'm going to take you up there. And Moses, I'm going to let you see the fulfillment of what I promised Abraham. You're going to get to see it. Abraham didn't see it. Isaac didn't see it. Jacob didn't see it. Joseph didn't see it. A lot of the ones that came out of Israel, he said, Aaron didn't see it. I'm going to let you see it. I think that's pretty cool how God does that with them up there on that. And then again, just a part about the death of Moses. And I like this. It's over in chapter 34. And it's in verse number 5. So chapter 34 is the last chapter. In verse number 5 it says this. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him. You know who he is? God. God buried him in the valley of the land of Moab over against Beth Peor, but no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. And Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. It means he was still at full strength, just as he was when he was at 40. He was 80. Right? And it says, and the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of the weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. So they wept for him for 30 days for that. And I find it interesting. He's the only person in the Bible that says God buried him. Only person in the Bible says God buried him. A couple other people, Elijah, Enoch, God just took them. Remember, they didn't see him. But it actually said that. You ever wonder why did God bury Moses? Why does nobody know? You ever wonder why that might be?
The one to worship him.
Yeah, that's my opinion.
Yeah.
Because who do the Jews constantly argue with Jesus? Moses. They would have made a god out of Moses. They would have made a god out of the shrine. And this is the place. Go see the place where Moses, like, I don't think God did that on purpose. It's because God will not give his glory. Yeah. I found that just interesting in that. So, I know we're kind of, I'll just put this down for you. The main character, just go ahead and let you know, no surprise here. Moses is the main character. He's the focal point. The only man that got buried in that. Special features. I'm going to write this down real quick for you. It's again just another kind of good example of, it's kind of, a lot of people call the book of Deuteronomy a miniature Pentateuch. It's kind of a mini Pentateuch because it really has everything that the other books of the Bible have. So like when you read Genesis, you see how they're destitute, right? I mean, man has fallen, man has sinned, they're destitute, right? They're without God, they're destitute. But then when you read the book of Exodus, you read about deliverance. right? And all that's explained here in the book, how he recaps it. And then the book of Leviticus is all about dedication, dedicating ourselves to God, and he reminds him over and over again, take heed lest thou forget, take heed lest thou forget in that. And in the book of Numbers, he reiterates the idea of discipline. You've got to be disciplined. And by the way, isn't the Christian life all about discipline, right? It's about a lot of discipline, trusting in the Lord. And then Deuteronomy is about direction and devotion. That's why we say this a lot around here. The Christian life is not about perfection, but it's about what? Direction, right? Direction. It's about direction. And then I only have one thing to write here, if you want to take time to read, because I know our time's up, is that chapter 18, verses, make sure I get it right here, verses 15 through 19, God says, I will raise up the prophet. By the way, if you look at that word prophet, it's capitalized, it's talking about deity. Okay? God says, I will raise up the prophet who will deliver you. I'll raise up the prophet who will be the last high priest. I will do that. That is fulfilled whenever you read Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. I think a fulfillment of that is right here. A fulfillment of that. And this is your writing. I'll just read part of this to you. Deuteronomy 18:15. The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet, capital, from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me, and ye shall hearken unto him. In that, it says in verse 17, the Lord said unto me, they have well spoken, that which they have spoken, I will raise up to them a prophet from among the brethren like unto thee, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command them. So it's a prophecy about Christ coming in that. So, anyway, if your hand's hurting, I apologize for that. But I'll just be honest with you, we've been going through this for 3 weeks. I kind of really hate letting Moses go, to be honest with you. I like him. I like him. But next week, and as we talked about the first week, first 5 books of the Bible are there. They're all about what? They're all about mankind, the history of mankind. It's the Pentateuch. So next week when we get together, we're going to start the history. God gives the history of people, so we start with the book of Joshua. In that, which by the way, when you ever follow somebody great, that should be a Joshua. You get to follow Moses. But anyhow, somebody might close us in prayer. I appreciate y'all coming tonight. I know we're tired and don't have BBS this week. If you didn't know that, we have BBS this week. And if you ordered a shirt or need a shirt, see Rachel. She's got these nice little shirts I'm displaying here. They're very comfortable.